I'm not going to sing today. Well, not to start. Maybe a little bit later. Well, we'll see how things go. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. As you would probably assume and would know, even at the CBC, we've been having many discussions about cannabis for our listeners, but also within our workplace about policy and regulations within the CBC, and I think every workplace is dealing with this right now and has been for some time. We have a number of panelists who will join us. I'm going to start at the podium and then I'll join you all on the couch. But as I do introduce you, please make your way to the couch up here. We'll start with Michelle Walker, who is a registered nurse with a postgraduate diploma in occupational health nursing. She works with insurers, healthcare and treatment providers, lawyers, unions, and employers from various industries to successfully implement work wellness programs. Now, in her current role at Manitoba Liquor and Lotteries, she coordinates occupational health resources for over 3,000 employees. Please put your hands together for Michelle. Next, I would like to bring to the stage Joel Gervais. He's an addictions and training specialist at CBI Health Center. He has worked in the field of mental health and addictions for the private and public sector for over 25 years. His experience includes over 2 decades with the Addictions Foundation of Manitoba, or AFM, and ultimately specializing in workplace services where he helped workplaces manage substance abuse and workplace intervention. Please welcome Joel Gervais. Christiane Deschamps is the Manager of Communications, Policy and Research at the Liquor, Gaming and Cannabis Authority of Manitoba, Manitoba's new cannabis regulator. Now, she has worked in regulation since 2005. Today, Christiane brings her unique background in social sciences, research and business to diverse projects that build policy and knowledge about the LGCA. Please put your hands together. I'm demanding, just telling you when to clap, when to stop. Also, and last but not least, Shannon Fender is the Director of Public Affairs for Canadian cannabis retailer Garden Variety, as well as Native Roots Dispensary based out of Denver, Colorado. Shannon's expertise is in building positive government and community relationships, in which she has executed proactive education projects for the cannabis industry. Now, Native Roots Dispensary was one of 4 applicants to receive a license in Manitoba and the first U.S. company to be awarded a retail cannabis license in Canada. Please put your hands together for Shannon. Now, I did say I would join them on the couch, but I don't want to crush anybody, so I'll leave you all room there, and I'm just going to stay over here at the podium because it makes me feel important. So some of these questions I'll just put out there, and whoever would like to take it on, please just start answering, but some of them I will direct, and I think everybody should take a chance at this question. It's been 40 days since legalization, and we'll start with you, Michelle. How have things been going in the first 40 days and 40 nights? Is it good so far, or there's been some challenges you've noted?
You know what, we don't experience a lot of change that we've noticed in our operation. We had quite robust policies and procedures already in place, and we made a point of not treating cannabis like something new in terms of our workplace policies and procedures. Our employees were quite familiar and used to adhering to substance use and workplace impairment policies. So that was something that they were still required to do, even though cannabis became legal. So, those things rolled out rather smoothly. We just made sure that we were quite diligent in our education for our employees and our managers, making sure that our employees were aware of what their responsibilities were, making sure our managers were informed of how to have those conversations with their employees and have questions, and also engaging our employees and preparing them to address questions from customers. So that's how our first 40 days rolled out.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Joel?
Well, I should probably address this from a couple of angles. First of all, from the clinical side, I mean, really the sky hasn't fallen. I really haven't seen a lot of more folks knocking on my door looking for assessment and treatment and all that kind of support. I mean, having said that, again, I don't want to deny the fact that, with more accessibility, we could see an issue, but, 40 days in. On the employer side, again, and, you could probably ask some of the employers that I'm working with, but again, for them, having this opportunity, and I call it an opportunity because, now they can continue to have that discussion with their employees about, what does fit for duty look like? and there is a teachable moment here, in time. I'd like to say this is a historical moment for employers where they can now, have this conversation because, it's kind of come out of the dark, and I think the message that's pretty clear is that, most of those employers that have been using for a while. And so now we can talk about, if you're struggling, how do you get help? And as a helping professional, that's something that I really appreciate is now it offers the opportunity for people to not feel, stigmatized and come forward and get the help if they need it.
Thank you. Christiane?
Thanks, Ismaila. Well, for us, it would be a big lie at the Liquor, Gaming, and Cannabis Authority to say that cannabis has not changed our workplace. We took on the role of regulating cannabis, and so we joke that we've been all weed all the time. We've been working around the clock leading up to this to license Manitoba's 13 new stores, with many more underway. We've done 2 province-wide public education campaigns, some posters of which are available in the back. And so that's kept us hopping. We've been working on the policy, the legislation, the regulation. We've developed a training program for all retailers that they're required to take. All staff must take it to know how to sell responsibly. So we've been busy. But that said, in terms of our own staff, we, like Michelle, have had policies that prevent the use of intoxicating substances in the workplace for a long time, and cannabis is no different. So even though we've been spending all of our time learning about this and focused on it, it hasn't changed the way people are behaving in the workplace, just what we do. I now find myself Googling things like how people make concentrated cannabis substances in the heel of a shoe, and that's legit use of my work time. But for our staff, it hasn't changed things mostly.
Thank you. Shannon?
Yes, thank you so much. It's so great to be here in Winnipeg from Denver. Thank you. Great to sit on this panel. From the from the retailer's perspective, I think that what we're seeing is what we anticipated, and something that, as we saw legalization roll out in Colorado for the first time in the world, was an anticipated shortage of product. Now that you have an industry that's coming fully into the light from the unregulated market, there seems to be quite a bit more demand. The anticipation that the LPs were going to have a little bit of trouble actually meeting that demand right off the bat. We did opt as Garden Variety to open up a little bit later, understanding that that supply was going to be in shortage. And so I think that, coming from the U.S., and Mr. Witcher spoke about it very eloquently earlier, but really we're excited about what Canada has done in Manitoba in particular, and so really we're just kind of seeing how everything is playing out, and excited to open our stores here pretty quickly.
And sticking with you, Shannon, something that you bring to this conversation that I think is important, and you have to know that leading up to October 17th of 2018, quite often people would cite Colorado as a place that we should look to see, well, how things rolled out there. And I wonder, as you're leading up to legalization there, what were the biggest concerns of business owners?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question, and something that, it really hasn't come to fruition, the concerns. As it was mentioned, there were cannabis consumers before the conversations of legalization, and there will be cannabis consumers for long after. Youth use is predominantly the one that came up. And I think that that's important to highlight right off the bat, because we've actually seen in the U.S., in Colorado in particular, based off surveys, a statistically significant decrease in youth use. And that is significant in that it's more than just, a drop off, but something about legalizing and regulating cannabis leads to less youth actually being able to access the product. We double check IDs as a best practice, use scanners to make sure, and then do a second check at the point of sale. And so I think that really has brought down the access for youth. Impaired driving, we have a partnership with Mothers Against Drunk Driving in Colorado. the first partnership of its kind actually in the US. Not able to take advantage of some of those partnerships as well based on Health Canada and their requirements around sponsorships, but really just promoting that even though this is cannabis and even though this may seem less harmful than prescription drugs or alcohol, that this actually is something that you should not drive, and impairment is impairment, whether it is alcohol, whether it is a prescription drug from your doctor, or whether it is cannabis. And so, really what we saw in Colorado was law enforcement, and the numbers are a little bit difficult to judge by because we had such an increase in funding for law enforcement to spot impaired drivers. So we haven't seen a huge increase in that impairment. We are tracking cannabis impaired driving a lot more closely. And so again, as Mr. Witcher said earlier, I think it's a great recommendation that you do start obtaining that data as soon as possible.
Joel, I wonder what you are hearing from employers here, what their major concerns are about legalized cannabis. How does it match up or pair up with what we're hearing there from?
Well, and again, there's a couple of elements there. Obviously, the workplace itself, the driving piece, which is a lot of the employers that I work with have, vehicles on the road. And, it goes back to this idea of impairment and, how do we, one of the things we know about impairment, especially around cannabis use, is we're still working on that, right? We don't have a good measuring stick yet that really says, okay, this is what a problem looks like. And, for most of the employers that I work with, that's where they want to intervene. They want to intervene at a place that, that doesn't get them in trouble ultimately, right? Because, intervention is about, and employee rights, all those issues come into play. So from an employer standpoint, the idea is that we want something that we can do to sort of identify this issue, if it's an issue, again, if it's an impairment issue, and to deal with it. So, safety sensitive work, risk sensitive work. We talk a lot about safety sensitive, but this idea of risk sensitive concerns me as well. I may not be driving a forklift or working a crane, but I may be working, on the front line somewhere, whether that's my accountant who's looking after my money. I don't know how much impairment I want with him. I'm silly enough with my money as it is. So the bottom line is, looking at the different roles that individuals play in the workplace, and ultimately going back to this notion of fit for duty, ultimately fitness for duty is the bottom line here. And I spend a lot of time talking to employers about this is what a problem might look like, but I also caution them, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's not always a duck. So what might be a mental health, or what look like a substance abuse issue, may be a mental health issue, maybe a physical issue, maybe a created by the workplace issue. The bottom line is you do something about it. But again, this whole discussion around cannabis is nice because people are now, I'm spending a lot more time with employers talking about what good intervention looks like in the workplace. And whether it's cannabis issue or another type of an impairment issue, that's the work.
Michelle,
I
you
can
have something
just
to
jump
say?
in. Yeah, we use this opportunity to really enforce our existing corporate values of workplace safety and social responsibility. So exactly right, it's an opportunity to engage in discussion, right? And impairment is impairment is impairment. So that's really the messaging we put forth to, if you're suspecting or seeing and noticing changes in your employees' behavior, things that aren't consistent, they usually are like this and now they're like this, it's an opportunity to engage in that discussion and to enforce that your existing policies and procedures and ensure that safe workplace is there for them. So it's really enforcing that opportunity to engage with your employees and determine, are there resources that they can be accessing as well for all those things that you mentioned, Joel.
Michelle, I wonder though, as an employer, how you walk that line and find that balance, because you want this open dialogue, which requires trust and a relationship between employer and employee, but at the same time, you're both educating and enforcing. How do you balance that?
So we really got in front of it in terms of educating our workforce on, hey, just so you know, cannabis is coming, and but that doesn't mean all of our existing policies and procedures go away. So we wanted to make sure that message was quite clear to them and saying, even if there's no change, guess what, employees, there's no change. And we actually have, one of the things I do is in health and wellness is a lot of in-person education with our employees, and we have an annual fall health fair, lots of information booths from community resources, and they come in and they have an interaction. So we had a cannabis info booth at our employee fall health fair, and we had an opportunity for them to ask questions and share health information with them, share our existing policies and procedures, give them information to take home to their families, how to talk to their kids, how to know the health effects, know what your purchase is going to be if that's something that you're considering, low risk use guidelines. So we are quite open about it and educating them on, hey, you know what, this is what the workplace implications are, but here's also home and health implications. So having that open interaction was quite important.
Thank you. One of the things that, let's call it a quirky thing about legalized cannabis in Canada is that each province has its own set of rules around it. And I wonder for, I mean, this could affect every business, but especially those that are national and would have employees that transfer and that sort of thing. Can we just get a breakdown of what the rules are here in Manitoba and how they may be different from other rules in different provinces?
Certainly. So we do see the regulatory landscape or the rules differ from province to province across Canada. And there have been some key things in Manitoba here that as the LGCA we've been working to educate all Manitobans about. This is based on our own research that shows that a lot of Manitobans did not understand many of the rules, even though they were widely discussed in media. And so in September, we launched a campaign province-wide to mainly focus on, you have to be 19 to legally purchase cannabis. It is shocking how many Manitobans still do not know that the legal age here is 19. And they expect that the legal age would be the same as alcohol. It's not. Also, one of the issues that we've seen is people expect that they can bring their kids to legal cannabis stores. So that is also prohibited. Cannabis, to keep it away from the hands of minors. Actually, minors are not, under the law, able to even view cannabis in our licensed stores. So people can't bring their kids. So even those small things we've been trying to get out to people. The fact that, as Mr. Witcher said this morning, you can't grow at home. Only a couple of provinces in Canada have opted for that model, and so that's something that there was a lot of misinformation about. And one of the top ones, and this one will really possibly surprise you, is you can only buy legal cannabis at legal stores. A lot of people didn't know that. They heard it's being legalized. I can go to the same guy I've been buying it from for years and it's now legal. No, the only legal cannabis, and this is true across Canada, not just Manitoba, but the only legal cannabis is cannabis that is sold to people who are 19 plus in a licensed store. And so we've just been trying to get that information out to everybody. We've actually had huge uptake from employers contacting us for posters, for handouts, so that they can provide this information in lunchrooms, in employee orientation packages, those kinds of things. We also have a lot of employers who have contacted us specifically about posters that you can't smoke or vape in public. That's another one where there's been a lot of confusion, and many employers saying, my employees want to smoke outside just like they would smoke tobacco outside, and that is not legal here in Manitoba.
I wonder how much of a challenge it adds into this, that we consider cannabis now both a medicine and a recreational substance. I wonder how that played out in Colorado.
That's an absolutely great question, and you know, you do find advocates that would ask for one streamlined licensing process. Individual here up in Canada, where you have to buy from the government, you have to buy directly through, you can't go in and buy it in a dispensary. You know, cannabis is a medicine, and absolutely we need the medicinal side. not super prepared to speak to whether or not it's the best model here. I know in Colorado it has been great to allow that interaction at the dispensary level for medicinal purposes. But as we have looked at the recreational side of adult use cannabis, having lower taxes would be great. Being able to kind of deal with those things in Colorado, which is a very unique market, get those markets more aligned. I think that you're going to have a much easier time up in Canada with folks doing that because they already know that this is just the model. There's less confusion in going in the store and, am I going for the medicinal side or am I going to the recreational side?
Michelle, what are your thoughts on that? The use of cannabis for recreation and as medicine, does that add another complexity into this for the workplace?
No, because medical accommodation of any number of things has been in place forever. So we have a number of employees, as does every workplace, with medical conditions and various medications that folks might be on. And so cannabis is another one of those. So you do your same diligence there in terms of determining accommodation, the need for accommodation, determining safe work. So that doesn't change in this process. With the recreation side, again, impairment is impairment is impairment, so you do have to ensure that you're coming to work fit for work.
Joel?
Well, I just wanted to remind people that folks have been self-medicating with cannabis for a long time, and ultimately, whether you have an access card or not, and whether your insurance company is paying for it or not, people have access to this drug in a different way now. I'm kind of thinking in my world, and I have lots of clients who have medical access cards, and have been using, and getting their prescription, quote unquote, or their dosage for the day from a regulated person, and may just choose to go to a government sponsored site to get it. And so, when it comes to the workplace, when people are talking about, I'm using medical marijuana, I mean, are they using it because, they're getting it from a practitioner or not? And I think that's the challenge that we're going to have going forward, maybe. This hasn't played itself out yet, but I think a lot of people who maybe tried to go that route may choose not to now because there are regulations around it. I mean, it's complicated. You have to.
And if I could just add, part of one of the things that we saw organically out of cannabis as a medicine in Colorado, certainly, and I think this is universal, is that for so long, a lot of people have struggled with illnesses where they were told by a doctor, this is what you take, this at this, whatever, however many times a day, and it didn't work for them. And so the ability to have the freedom to, work with cannabis at a little bit more personal level where you're able to, try different things, I think that that's something that, people really value in terms of medicinal cannabis.
Should employers be concerned about cannabis use outside of work hours? Is that something that they should have top of mind, or is it just within work hours that employers should be concerned about cannabis use? Because even when we're talking about the different rules for cannabis across Canada, there are different rules for different workplaces. I mean, we hear about some police forces that have banned cannabis use completely for their officers, where some stick with the rule of you need to be fit for your shift. So how concerned should employers be about cannabis use outside of work hours for anyone who wants to take it?
I'll hop in. So not a lot of our industries, mine in particular, does anything like drug testing. So we do rely on our observations of determining fitness for work or impairment in that case. So really what happens outside of work, if it does impact you coming into work, that's where we become involved. So no changes on our stance for employees to ensure that anything that they consume outside of work or in proximity to work hours, if it's impacting them during work hours or during their work tasks, is something that we now have to engage with them on. So I'm not sure if there might be other industries, transportation, that kind of thing, where there's drug testing involved, but that's...
And I work with a lot of regulated industries, like aerospace and oil and gas and all those folks. And I mean, there's some fairly rigid lines being drawn in those industries, and a lot of that's based on the reality is that, again, that measuring stick problem. Most of these folks drug test. on a regular basis. And, they drug test, some of them can even drug test randomly. So, again, the presence of the substance doesn't necessarily determine an impairment issue. So the idea of, and again, this idea of legislating people's social behavior outside of the workplace, I struggle with. We're not going to be asking people whether they're smoking cannabis. I heard that this morning. Whether they're smoking cannabis away from the workplace, right? On a weekend or on a trip to Vegas or wherever they're. Sorry, I don't know. Not Vegas. Trip to Killarney, I guess now. So the idea is, again, it goes back to this whole notion of what does your policy say, and I know I've traveled with a lawyer for the last couple of years, not because I'm in trouble,
okay,
but because I
was a little concerned there, Bill.
and she's in the building right now, which is really good. But the bottom line is that we've set some standards around these, and people need to abide by those standards, follow your rules, and if you are concerned that this may impact your work, maybe this is a decision you need to make. I work with electricians. If you're concerned that the impact of long-term regular use might impact decision making in complex tasks and all those sorts of things, maybe you have a decision to make around that. Sorry.
One thing I was curious about actually, and I think Shannon, you can answer this. Hopefully you can. The idea that, it's one thing to legislate to make cannabis legal. It's a completely different thing to have the social view of that change as well. The stigma sticks around. I wonder if that's still something that's being dealt with in Colorado. The idea that even though it is legal, there is a great deal of concern from a lot of employees that their employer will still have a negative view and it could impact their employment.
Absolutely. It's coming up on my 2-year anniversary, actually, of coming on with Native Roots and now being part of Garden Variety in Canada. I even myself, as a professional, had a little bit of hesitation about, wow, what if this whole thing goes away? What if everything crashes? Am I going to be able to go back out into the workplace and have that legitimacy? I no longer have that fear. In fact, working in such a highly regulated industry only has really bolstered my ability and my skill set. And really the way that we have viewed cannabis in our company is that this is a career. We want to train you to be able to make it to the next step. We want you to be able to move up, whether that's within our company, hopefully, but if you choose to go out and you've learned skills within our company that you can take another position. I believe that the stigma even about 3 years ago in Colorado still existed in the workplace. I don't believe it does anymore. And in Canada, because you have had the full federal legalization and because, LGCA, among many of the other groups that are regulating, you've taken on an approach where you're looking at this not as a separate bad business. You're looking at us as an industry that is professionalized, that does respect our communities. And I think that that's made the world of difference in terms of you won't have those same growing pains, I believe, that we had in Colorado and the US.
Christiane.
I just wanted to say further to that, you have seen so much change in Colorado, but I think what we're really emphasizing here in Canada too is that paradigm shifts take a long time, and we always like to remind people as the LGCA that we're in the very early days of this in terms of the law, in terms of public knowledge about it, in terms of research, as all of my colleagues here have said, there's a lot we don't know. And so in terms of the stigma, we are really encouraging people to give it time. And people keep phoning us and saying, but it's just like liquor. If you think back to 100 years ago when liquor was legalized, when prohibition was lifted, there were no office Christmas parties because men and women could not consume liquor in the same space legally. There could be no dancing in the same space where liquor was sold or consumed. That was actually in our laws in Manitoba, no dancing. To buy alcohol, you had to go to a liquor store, give your name, address, if you were a woman, your husband's name, and they kept track as the government of how much you drank, how much you purchased, and that was kept in a log and could be provided without your consent to law enforcement and medical professionals. So we've seen a massive change with alcohol, and you have to think that over time, as the stigma changes, as we see more public education, more information, and a different culture of lower risk, safe use emerge through these kinds of conversations, we'll see really different conversations happen in the workforce.
I wonder, Christiane, sticking with you, if we expect to see the stigma around cannabis change, we expect awareness to change over time as well. Can we also expect the rules to adjust over time as well as they stand right now?
Well, I certainly can't make any promises. But certainly with other regulated activities, such as gambling with liquor, we've seen a constant evolution of these. So iterations of the laws, of the regulation, as social expectations change. So there are things as sweeping as the introduction of spaces where people could drink in public, and not it just having to be in your own home, or like I said, men and women being able to consume liquor in the same space without fear of terrible consequences. So, we see that evolution. With gambling, it's been the same thing. I think in 100 years, my great-grandchildren will laugh at how cannabis was legalized when Granny was.
But just to be clear, men and women can consume cannabis in the same space and dance.
Yes.
Okay.
But they cannot
Should they,
smoke or vape in public, whether alone or together.
There we go. Okay. Well, with that though, and this is what I wanted to get to, Michelle, is how prepared do employers need to be to adjust as time goes on? I mean, I feel we hear from some people, I've got a policy, we're good to go, and that's that.
Yeah, so it's not a one and done for anything, right? You constantly have to be reviewing your policies and procedures for any environmental changes, including legalization of cannabis, for example, or any modifications that might come down the road in relation to that. So you're constantly updating that and addressing unique concerns that might come up from not only your employees, but maybe from your lines of business or from your engagement with customers and communities. So it's a constant, it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? So you have to continue being diligent is my advice there.
Thank you. Joel, you had touched on something earlier. I was hoping we could get into a bit more detail here about how different industries treat cannabis policy. I mean, should we be treating things differently based on risk in the type of work that's being done?
Well, I mean, to clarify, when I say they're treating it differently, again, the potential liabilities seem to be a little bit greater. Mm-hmm. And, some of the employers that I've worked with, ultimately, this is a business decision for them because they want to, bid on jobs. And in order to do that, they need to demonstrate that they've done their due diligence around this, right? And, some of the employers are saying, sorry, or sort of the contracts that they're going out and saying, sorry, cannabis is not okay for us at this time. So, it's being treated differently, but ultimately going back to this notion of an impairing substance, it shouldn't be treated differently, with the potential on that risk side. I mean, now, when I talked about this idea of safety sensitive, I mean, the courts have been kind enough to not actually define what that is, which makes things a little bit more complicated, but ultimately gives us the freedom to say, hey, these are the jobs. I was just at an employer a while ago, a large manufacturer, who had me in to kind of do, this is your brain on drugs kind of thing. And they actually showed me a chart that sort of looked at the different thresholds of safety risk. Now, again, cannabis is going to connect in one of those, but at the end of the day, it's just about assessing, okay, what are we comfortable with? And I think that's what I'm seeing is a lot of employers are feeling it out and saying, what are we comfortable with and what are we not comfortable with? This has opened up that conversation. And not all of them have policies yet. I mean, the bottom line is some people are waiting for the cards to fall and for folks to lawyer up and see where things go, because employees are still making decisions about whether they think this is their right or not to use. So when it comes to the industries, I think everybody's looking at themselves and saying how much risk do we want? And again, as a legal substance, I mean, it creates a different social norm out there to say, I mean, it was easy when it was an illicit substance. You just say zero tolerance. But now you're just saying, okay, responsible use, right? Which we always ask for anyways,
I was saving this one for closer to the end of the discussion here. I think we have about 7 minutes left, but we've been talking about cannabis this whole time, and it is top of mind for, many Canadians, and we've also been talking a lot in this country about methamphetamines and about opioids and addiction. I wonder how cannabis fits into that conversation, because I also know one of the common misconceptions about cannabis, and I hear it all the time from people, is it's not addictive. I can't be addicted to cannabis. How much should cannabis be involved in the conversation about addictions?
As the addiction specialist, I might jump in, but I'd like to hear also from the folks, especially industry folks, because I really feel like we need to, and this afternoon in my session, not plugging it in all, and talk a little bit about what addiction is, because ultimately it's about an unhealthy relationship with anything. I mean, whether that's alcohol, drugs, gambling, my cell phone, you name it. So the bottom line is and the other reality is a drug is a drug is a drug. So dependency doesn't always have to be a physical dependency. The psychological dependency, and this is in the work that I've done and in the clients that I've seen, a majority of them aren't really dealing with this overwhelming physical addiction. Because as we discussed this morning, yeah, the hangover's not that bad. Okay, but at the end of the day, this psychological need really and again, this can develop with any drug. And that psychological need, this idea that I got to get up in the morning and wake and bake, and that's the only way I can get to work. And I'm not enjoying any experiences unless I'm using this drug. Again, that's an unhealthy relationship. To me, that fits in there. Whether we're going to see it, like I said, we're not going to. My guess is, and this is not a scientific sort of thing, my guess is we're not going to see a real upswing in terms of psychological need for this drug. I mean, people are going to enjoy it or not. That's the bottom line. My philosophy, again, the people who are using will keep using. The people who haven't will try it, don't like it, never do it again.
Shannon?
Yes, and the people who are using harder substances like methamphetamine, like opioids, heroin, they may very well see this as an outlet to come off of those. I can speak from the US, and not just in medical states, medical-only states, but in states that have legalized adult recreational use as well. You've seen sometimes in the double digits of opioid-related deaths going down. And I think that is something that is really phenomenal and something that we need to embrace. It would be foolish for anyone in the cannabis industry to say that there is no potential for abuse. There's potential for abuse of anything. But in terms of harm reduction, in terms of offering an alternative for someone to recreate that is not going to lead them down the path of severe addictions with some of these harder drugs, I think it's just been a phenomenal opportunity for anyone who has been in a legalized state or province.
Christiane?
Because people have already been using cannabis for a long time, as we've been talking about, we have numbers on this. So as Mr. Witcher pointed out this morning, our own research shows that about 2.3% of Manitobans, or it's about give or take 1 in 10 users, are likely to develop that unhealthy relationship with cannabis. With the number of people who are saying that they intend to use it, currently we have about 20% of Manitobans who say that they are users. We have about 20% more who say that they might or will try it now that it's legal. This is still the minority of Manitobans. So we don't expect a dramatic increase necessarily in those numbers. Also, we know from some anecdotal research more than anything, because again, it's early days for research, but we know that the people who have held off until legalization to try cannabis are, at least anecdotally, more likely to follow the rules. They're calling the LGCA, they're asking what they can do to lower their risk. So we're hoping that crop of people who are trying legal cannabis will equip themselves to do so in a way that lowers their risk of those negative consequences.
Yeah, excellent. That's one of the stances that we took as well, was education up front, right? And encourage that sharing of information, not only with the employees, but taking it home and discussing with their families and their kids. And I think any employer needs to be prepared to assist employees who are suffering from addiction from anything at this point. Not just cannabis or meth, but any other substance, whether it be drugs or psychological impairments that they might be suffering from other things. So yeah, it's kind of business as usual there to make sure you have that process in place to recognize someone struggling with addictions in your workplace, have that conversation with them and assist them through that. So.
And there's 1:37 left, so I'm just going to sing it out here. I'm just joking. I did want to ask, though, before we wrap things up here, and I think this is best directed at you, Christiane. Looking ahead over the next 2 years, what do you see as the biggest challenges or opportunities we're going to face when it comes to legal cannabis?
Oh boy, that's a tricky question. I mean, I think in Canada, something that everybody is looking at right now is the legalization of edibles and concentrates, which the federal government has said that they will legalize within a year of the initial legalization. So we're preparing for that because, again, what we're finding in our own research is that Manitobans have a lot of knowledge gaps about edibles, about how long they take to be processed in someone's system. So as again, as was discussed this morning, there's a real a potential for overconsumption and harm associated with that. Concentrates as well introduce a whole other type of products into the marketplace, and so again, that demands a lot of education. These are also products that we know a lot of people who are waiting to try cannabis legally might wait for, because there's still some additional stigma for some people around smoking. Whereas with those edible products, there's a little less of a learning curve to figure out how to just pop in